Hello everyone, welcome to AMH 2010, U.S. History Introductory Survey since 1877. In this video we're going to discuss the United States' involvement in the First World War, more commonly known as World War I in the United States. And I'm going to discuss the causes of the war, both long-term or longue durée, as well as the short-term causes of the war. And then we'll discuss the general course of the war, and we'll discuss America's entrance, or you might say delayed entrance, into the conflict. And this background is important because it will help to explain and really elucidate why Americans, particularly President Woodrow Wilson, wanted the United States to remain out of the war for until 1917. So I'll begin by going over some of the longue durée causes of World War I. Remember, it's generally not called World War I. People at the time didn't know there was going to be another global conflict 20 years later. Typically it was called the Great War, or in some cases the War to End All Wars. That was a popular term as well, because many people hoped optimistically and perhaps naively that this would be the last great global war in human history, and it certainly was not. There are many long-term or longue durée causes for this conflict, though it doesn't happen out of nowhere. To begin, one of the biggest longue durée causes it's often cited by historians and that people are aware of in the popular culture are entangling alliances, complex and often secret alliances between the European empires. And many European heads of state were related to each other, most notably the Russian Tsar, the German Kaiser, and then the King of Great Britain. And these alliances can be very complex, and each empire is looking to grow its power and at the same time consolidate what power, what territory it has. And while these nations have alliances together, they don't always get along very well. Other longue durée factors that are cited: German militarism and expansionism. Germany had become a nation state and empire in the mid-1800s. It had fought wars against its neighbors, Austria and France, and out of these wars, the German Empire emerges, particularly the Prussian German Empire. Prussia was the most powerful of these German states. It fought wars against its German-speaking neighbor, Austria, and eventually fought a series of conflicts to galvanize the other independent German-speaking nations to the west to bring them into a single German empire. And then they allied themselves with the Austrian Empire, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as the 19th century comes to a close and the 20th century begins. The most notable of these conflicts was the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, which was a smashing German victory. But the Germans were preparing for future wars. They believed in the old adage, to prepare for peace, you must prepare for war. As they say in Latin, para pacem, para bellum. And this was something that Otto von Bismarck, the very famous German politician and military theorist, believed, as well as Heinrich Schlieffen as well. So, actually, it was Alfred von Schlieffen. I was thinking of Heinrich Schliemann, the German archaeologist that investigated the city of Troy. And Schlieffen in particular believed that other European powers, including Britain, France, and Russia, might declare war on Germany in the future, particularly France and Russia. And Germany is strategically in a very difficult position in Central Europe. It's got France, a very powerful neighbor, to its west, and then Russia, a very powerful neighbor to its east. And while Russia and France are very different countries, very different powers, they'd become allies in the 19th century to check the power of Germany. And of course, alliances and allegiances are always shifting. During the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Russia, but as time had gone on, France and Russia had become allies to balance out German power. Another longue durée cause for World War I as well is French revanchism, and this is a term that means revenge, a desire for revenge on Germany. This was a major element of French culture in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And the French were very angry that Germany had essentially humiliated them during the Franco-Prussian War back in the 1870s. And they were also angry just about the war itself, that it was an unjust conflict. As with many wars, though, there's blame to go around on both sides. And then a topic that often gets brought up as well in causing World War I is nationalism. And there's nationalism within these empires. Germany wants to build a powerful empire, a powerful nation state for the German people. The French people wanted to strengthen their empire in Western Europe, and they want to have revenge on Germany. There's nationalism within the empires, but there's also nationalism for the ethnic groups living in the Balkans. And these ethnic groups want to have self-determination. They want to have their own countries to themselves. They don't want to be part of other foreign empires like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which in particular was trying to expand its territorial holdings in the Balkans during this period. The Balkans have been called the powder keg of Europe, and you're going to see why. Meanwhile, older empires like the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman Turks, their power in the Balkans have been collapsing. So there's a power vacuum, and there's other players that are trying to expand in the region. And of course, Russia and Italy also have interests in the Balkans as well. And this is a very diverse region of Europe. It's multi-ethnic, multi-religious. There are Roman Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and Muslims living in this part of Europe. And these ethnic groups all would like to have their own countries where they can practice their culture and their religion. And the older or larger established empires in some ways are a threat to that. And this is a factor that doesn't get talked about as much, but I believe it was a factor, if not a major motivating factor. It was certainly an accelerant, I think, in causing World War I. And this is progressivism, particularly progressivism in the Anglophone countries, most notably the United States and Great Britain. American and to some degree British politicians and political leaders, thought leaders in these countries, they were much more focused on dealing with domestic social problems, things like women's suffrage, and many people believed that the technology that they developed in the late 1800s and early 1900s had made war obsolete. You can see this particularly in the work of a guy named Norman Angell, and it's also important to think about progressivism as well, because Britain and the United States are beginning to really mend their relationship, and they're beginning to develop what is called the special relationship. Because for many years, Britain and the United States had not liked each other, but as the 1800s were coming to an end and the 1900s were beginning, even though there were still strains on their relationship, Britain and the U.S. were getting along a lot better, in large part because now they had a common enemy, Germany. This is a quick rundown of the emerging special relationship between Great Britain, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Sometimes you see this terminology used today in the present by British or American politicians to describe the alliance that we have across the Atlantic, or across the pond, as the British might say. Before the turn of the century period, though, the United States and Great Britain had a much more strained relationship. We'd fought the Revolutionary War to gain independence from the British. We'd fought the British again in the War of 1812. And then we really nearly came to war again with the British in the 1830s, in the 1840s, and the 1850s, and during the U.S. Civil War as well. And Americans in the mid-1800s and early 1800s really thought that the British were trying to prevent American expansionism. Former President Andrew Jackson had said that the British were trying to build an iron ring to stop American expansion and Manifest Destiny, or what would have been called Manifest Destiny at that point in the period. But as times went on, things begin to be less antagonistic. Yes, we are competing with Great Britain in the imperial game in the Caribbean and in the Pacific, But things are changing as new enemies, particularly Germany, are emerging. We now have a common enemy in Germany, and as they say, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So Britain and the U.S. come together against Germany. At the same time, there's things that are happening specifically within the United States that are helping this special relationship to develop. Many upper class Americans who had more English, or what we would call WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant ancestry, either real or imagined WASP ancestry, began to really connect with America's English past. The idea that they were related to someone who had come over on the Mayflower, for example. And this is as a result of demographic changes that are happening in the United States, thanks to, in large part, to immigration from Southern Europe, Eastern Europe. Upper class Americans really want to distinguish themselves from German Americans, Irish Americans, Italian Americans, Hungarian Americans, Russian Americans, etc. And they do that by identifying with the British upper class. Even elements of the English language are changing during this period. Upper class people on the East Coast begin to speak what is often called the transatlantic or mid-Atlantic accent, which sounds much more like a British accent than American English. And this special relationship is going to inspire the U.S. to support the Entente, the side that the British are on in World War I, and eventually join the war in 1917. And this cartoon from 1899 illustrates how Uncle Sam and many upper class Americans, white upper class Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans, viewed the immigration and demographic changes that were going on in their country. And it helps to explain why some of them might have decided they liked the British a little bit more. And you see, if you look closely, an Irish American in stereotypical Irish styles, and then how an Irish person in America would dress, and then a German person, how they would dress in Germany, and then how they would dress in the United States. A French person, how they might dress in France, and then how they might dress in the United States. An Italian and a Hungarian. It's an interesting idea, actually, that diasporate cultures, they will evolve and change as a result of being in a new place and as a result of mixing with the native-born populations culturally. This is Norman Angell, and he definitely epitomizes that special relationship between the U.S. and Britain that's emerging in this period. He was a British journalist who lived in the United States, and he definitely is a progressive. You might even call him a bit of a muckraker in his writing about warfare and technology. He was also a pacifist as well, and some progressives were pacifists. Others were very militaristic, though. Most notably, Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive U.S. president and a strong militarist. Some might even call him perhaps a jingoist as well, supporting very aggressive U.S. foreign policy, often at the expense of other nations. And Angell wrote the book The Great Illusion. Came out in 1910 and 1911, and the central thesis of the book, put simply, is that industrialization and international trade, the Industrial Revolution that had happened in the United States and had already happened in Britain and parts of Europe, basically it had made war unprofitable, and that more economic wealth would be destroyed in war than would be created by war, because we don't have wars of conquest anymore, wars of mass territorial aggrandizement, and that essentially war was going to be futile and it was going to be obsolete, and instead countries would peacefully fix their problems more diplomatically, to protect their supply chains and protect their economies. In fact, Angell argued that countries that spent too much money preparing for war, particularly continental European countries like France with their revanchism, Germany with their vigilance and fears of a war with their neighbors, that was going to be actually going to set you behind. It would actually damage your country. You might even die out in the future because you made the wrong priorities. And Angell, of course, we know is flat out wrong. There are people that can make a lot of money during warfare. Arms dealers, weapons suppliers, the so-called merchants of death, in the language of the early 20th century. And the book had a resurgence, though, in the 1930s as people hopelessly, uh, perhaps in a bit of willful ignorance, hoped that there would never be another great war. And then, of course, we know what happens. The Second World War, World War II happens. And the book is popular in Anglophone areas, people who can read and speak English. And you can really see it in U.S. and British policy as well. Um, Britain is focusing on what is called the Three Circles Doctrine, in which it is prioritizing its colonies and in its relationship with the United States. And Europe is kind of a third circle. It's not the primary priority, even though Britain is in Europe. And many British people think of themselves as not really being European in the same way that a French person or a German or a continental European is, even to this day. Um, Continental Europeans, you would say, in some ways they knew better, and they were preparing for the next conflict. And Americans also wanted to believe that big wars were not going to be happening in the future. Many hoped that this is related to the social gospel idea of the progressive era, that the world was going to get better and better and better, social problems would be fixed, and then Jesus Christ might return, and the world would end, and there would be heaven on earth. Sort of a utopian, apocalyptic kind of belief in the United States. But in some ways, this idea is going to be drastically proved wrong about coming peace. Here's a bit more about French revanchism. France had been really humiliated in the Franco-Prussian War. They'd struggled with command issues. Their leader, Napoleon III, was really in some ways on his way out as leader, even before the war happened. And, well, Germany, in many ways, provoked the war as a way to galvanize the German-speaking countries. When I say Germany, I mean Prussia, to galvanize the German-speaking countries together. France also went along with it because the French were angry with the Germans, and and Napoleon III was looking to consolidate his power. And France traditionally had a very large and powerful and well-trained army. They'd made some really important military discoveries in military technology and tradition, and you wouldn't have expected them to have been defeated so badly by the Germans, but they were. And they also lost territory, most notably the territory of Alsace-Lorraine, which young French students in the late 1800s and the early 1900s were taught in school that this territory was stolen from them during the Franco-Prussian War, that they had to take it back. And so, a generation of young French people, really multiple generations of French people, have been taught that they needed to have revenge on Germany. I do want to unpack German militarism a bit more. The German people, there's many different German peoples, but they become part of a single empire. Not including the people of Austria who speak the same language, speak the German language, and the German-speaking people in Switzerland. But as time goes on, Prussia begins to take over other German states to the west. And Otto von Bismarck, the very famous Prussian statesman and military theorist, his goal was he wanted to have all German people be together as a single empire as time went on. He is a very nationalist politician, and he's an imperialist as well. He does want to bring these groups that do have some similarities in terms of language and culture together, even if they have some religious differences. For example, there are Catholic Germans. There are also Austrians are predominantly a Catholic group, and Bismarck was very much pro-Protestant. In fact, some of his anti-Catholic political moves will actually lead to German Catholics leaving the Prussian Empire and coming to the United States in the late 1800s. Although many German people, though, they still liked Bismarck, and there's even towns in North Dakota named after him, like Bismarck, North Dakota. And German culture had long had a strong military tradition, a martial tradition. And really, you needed to have this, as I said, when you're smack between Russia and France with very few natural obstacles between you and your rivals. You have to have a strong military culture, and you can definitely see some earlier Prussian leaders like Frederick the Great, for example. And they used to say that Prussia which would eventually build the German Empire, that it was an army with a nation attached to it. And the Prussian education model, it really emphasized discipline, adhering to orders, showing up on time, working hard, industry, things that you're going to need to have a strong military and a strong economy to support that military. Germany was also industrializing, its economy was growing, and it was very dynamic as well. And they had implemented things like universal male conscription. So they had a culture of preparing for war, as I mentioned on a previous slide. And some of these policies did actually lead to increased immigration of Germans to the United States. Those that were Catholic wanted to leave the country. Those that did not want to be conscripted into the military, they might leave the country. Also, Germans with more radical ideas, like socialists, for example, would be more likely to want to leave the country as well, because Bismarck was not a socialist. He did support some social safety nets and welfare programs, but he did this really to try to keep socialism from becoming too popular. And there are a series of conflicts that helped to build the German Empire, wars against Austria in 1866, and then, of course, the war against France from 1870 to 71. And after the Franco-Prussian War, Prussia becomes the German Empire, and Bismarck is going to serve as the chancellor and as an advisor to the German monarchs or Kaisers. Even though Bismarck was an aggressive military leader and he was preparing for future wars, he did recognize that there were certain areas where Germany had to be careful. In particular, he wanted to avoid being too antagonistic to other countries, especially Britain. He wanted to focus on building a contiguous land-based empire that's centered in continental Europe for Germany. He didn't want to try to build a large overseas empire like what France or Britain had, and he wanted to avoid building too large of a navy as well, because that would also challenge Great Britain. But things begin to change after 1890 when Bismarck retires. The new young Kaiser, Kaiser William or Wilhelm II, he begins to really repudiate Bismarck's more balanced foreign policy, which you could say escalates the possibility of a future war. And you'll see why soon. In the 1800s and into the 1900s, European political theorists and leaders thought of Europe in terms of balance of power theory. And basically the idea was Europe would be divided into political alliances, and as long as one nation didn't try to become too much more powerful than the others, things would be okay. And sometimes alliances do have to shift over time. Particularly France and Russia had once been enemies, but they become allies against Germany. Really, even Britain and France had been bitter enemies into the early 1800s, but then they become allies in many ways because of Germany, just as the US and Britain are quickly becoming allies. So you have the Triple Alliance, which is centered on continental Europe. It includes Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy, and it's in act until 1882 to 1915. Italy leaves the Triple Alliance and actually will go over to the Entente side because they have rival territorial goals in the Balkans. They also want to expand in the Balkans, which makes them basically an adversary of Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We have the Triple Entente as well, which is France, Britain, and Russia. It's an easy way to remember it is Entente is a French word. France is in the Entente. Britain and Russia are allies of France. And as I said, these countries for many years had been enemies, but they will come together against Germany to try to check German power. And this is not something that commonly gets talked about with balance of power theory, but I think it's an interesting way to look at these countries. Each major power has kind of a signature resource or ability. If you want to think about it like in Risk board game or video game terms. For Britain, they have the best navy, the most powerful navy, and they have the best kind of sailing maritime traditions. Their economy is based around trade overseas. France has the best army. They may sound weird to people in the 21st century. In America in particular, we make a lot of jokes about France not being very militarily powerful, that they maybe surrender too easily. It's really not true at all of the French. French military theorists and officers made some very important discoveries in military tactics and traditions and technology. Most notably during the French Revolution, the French had the levée en masse in the Revolution, which was really the first modern national conscription or draft. And other countries will pattern their conscription, their drafts, off of the original French levée en masse. And of course, Germany adopts universal male conscription as well. And Russia has the most land and the most people. And technically, the Russian army was bigger than the French army. But the thing is, Russia, being such a big, sprawling country, and really in many ways being less industrially developed than Germany or Britain or even France, it's going to take longer to mobilize. So with the Russians, it's all about territory and people. With the French, it's about having a strong military culture and military tradition. With the British, it's all about having a really powerful navy and good naval traditions. And under Kaiser Wilhelm, Germany is going to be challenging all of these countries, especially Britain. Britain had the British Navy. Kaiser Wilhelm orchestrates the construction of the High Seas Fleet, which you can see here on this slide, and also colonial empires as well. Remember, Bismarck did not want to emphasize building an overseas colonial empire for Germany, but that was something that Kaiser Wilhelm wanted, which that's not going to be as much of a concern for Russia, but it will be a concern for France and Britain. So you'll see the territories in black in Africa that Germany is trying to gain hold of, and also the territories in the Pacific as well, which that's an area where the United States begins to become a bit more concerned about what Germany is up to. And Germany was even trying to flex its soft power in Latin America. They were trying to forcefully collect debts in Venezuela, for example. There were rumors of a possible German alliance with the dictator Victoriano Huerta in the Mexican Revolution. And you're going to see Germany is going to try some other things in Mexico during World War I. But to become a maritime empire, the thinking during this period was, in order to be a proper empire, you had to have a large navy. That was Alfred Thayer Mahan, the American naval theorist, who said that. Bismarck believed that, but not Bismarck. Kaiser Wilhelm believed that, but really, geographically, Germany is just not positioned well to be a maritime empire the way Britain and France are. Germany's navy can be very easily bottled up by blocking off the English Channel, and by blocking off the North Sea. And you really is essentially what you see during World War I. The British Navy are going to blockade the German Navy, and the Germans are going to try to break out at the Battle of Jutland in 1916, but they're going to fail to do so, which means that Germany is not going to have a over-the-seas navy. They're going to have a under-the-seas navy, or a U-boat submarine navy in World War I. So who is the most responsible for causing World War I? We don't need to pin the responsibility for the war on one specific country. I think there was blame to go around for many nations. But, people will ask this in the general public. It's nice to have someone to point your finger at, essentially. And unlike World War II, where the aggressors are much clearer, World War I, there's more gray areas, there's more nuance. It's harder to say. I do think all the great powers do play a role, and you're going to see why when we get to the more immediate causes of World War I. Scholars generally put the most blame on Germany, though, because the Germans were doing the most to kind of upend the status quo in Europe. Challenging Britain with a large navy and with colonies, challenging France with colonies and a large, powerful army, and then challenging Russia by just taking over territory and kind of being a sort of dangerous, expansive neighbor. And contemporaries recognize this, and later authors recognize this. Most notably, a post-World War II German historian. He was from Germany. His name was Fritz Fischer. He wrote a book called Germany's War Aims in World War I. And here's a contemporary cartoon showing Kaiser Wilhelm kind of rocking the boat in Europe. Meanwhile, the other European powers are annoyed and frustrated with what he's doing. So you have the Kaiser here. You can recognize him by his crown. Then you have King Alfonso of Spain, who's a baby. Remember, Spain is very weak during this period because they've lost their colonial empire largely to the United States. Up next, we have France, portrayed in revolutionary garb. And then we have Franz Joseph of Austria, who was an ally of Germany, but still is unsure about what his rogue ally is getting up to. And here is Umberto of Italy, the King of Italy, who had been an ally of Germany as well, but is also a bit annoyed at what the young Kaiser is up to. Notice that Great Britain is not on the boat because the British Isles are in Europe, but they're sort of separate from Europe because they're an island nation. This is another cartoon from the period. It's showing Germany being very concerned about what's going to happen now that Kaiser Wilhelm is retiring from his position as chancellor. What will young Kaiser Wilhelm do? He's sitting on a dangerous powder keg of brinkmanship with warfare, bombs, even the threat of socialism and radical politics. Wilhelm was not a socialist, but resisting socialism was something that Bismarck had really committed himself to doing. And what if his successor, Kaiser Wilhelm, was not as effective as he had been? And again, these three leaders, Kaiser Wilhelm, King George V of England, and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, they're all cousins. They're all related to each other. In fact, the House of Windsor, their original name was the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, because they were a German family that had come to take over the British Empire through marriages and alliances. They will change their name to Windsor in 1917 because they don't want to sound too German because Germany is the enemy. Now we'll get into the more immediate causes of World War I. We've been talking about the gunpowder, the dynamite, the flammable materials that have been stacked up over the decades. Now we're going to talk about the spark that's going to start the fire or start the explosion. In the spring and summer of 1918, Austro-Hungarian leader Franz Ferdinand, he was the Archduke. He was the next in line to be the emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was touring Sarajevo in what is now Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but it's a territory that's ethnically Bosnian. There are different religious beliefs, different cultural beliefs than the Austrians. And really, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is a very large, very diverse, multi-ethnic empire. While they're touring the city of Sarajevo, there is an attempt to assassinate the Archduke. Bosnian nationalists try to blow up his motorcade, and eventually they'll fail to blow it up with bombs, but they will shoot the Archduke. A young Bosnian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip is going to be arrested for shooting the Archduke. He was part of a group called the Young Bosnia movement. They were Bosnian nationalists. There are rumors and suspicions that he also may have been part of a terrorist group called the Black Hands. And the terrorist group, the Black Hands, are backed by Serbia. Serbia is a country that is not a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but they are an ethnically Slavic country in terms of their language and in terms of their religion. That makes them kind of allies with Russia. And Russia was sympathetic to Serbian nationalism, seeing them as kind of a sister people. and so they're going to be sympathetic to the Serbs. In response to the death of the Archduke, the Austro-Hungarian Empire looks to advance its territorial holdings in the Balkans and to crack down on anti-imperial resistance in the region. And Germany supports them. Germany gives them carte blanche to do so. Germany's going to back them. That's something that really angers Russia. Russia will declare war on on Austro-Hungary, largely because of Serbia. And in response, Germany will declare war on Russia to back up its ally, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who it had given carte blanche to. In response to this, now we have Germany and Austria-Hungary fighting against Serbia and Russia. The Ottoman Turks, a longtime enemy of the Russian Empire, going back hundreds of years, they're going to go to war against Russia for religious reasons, for territorial reasons. There's many reasons why the Ottoman Turks don't like the Russians. And the Ottoman Empire, it's been called the sick man of Europe. It's been struggling for centuries, really, kind of propped up by other European powers to preserve that balance of power. But believe it or not, the Ottoman Empire actually made some really interesting military reforms in the late 1800s. So I think members of the Ottoman military saw this conflict not only as a chance to fight Russia, but to maybe try out their new army that they had created. The days of the Janissaries are long gone, and now we have what they call in Turkish Nizami Jadid. But the Ottoman Empire is it's a multi-ethnic empire, a multi-religious empire as well, but the leadership of the country and the people who control the country are Muslim, and so they have to create a story that the German Kaiser secretly converted to Islam. That way they could justify allying themselves with a Christian power. And that rumor was developed by the Ottoman Sheikh al-Islam, who was sort of a religious cleric that helped the Sultan rule the empire. So the war is on, and France will now join the war because they are an ally of Russia. They, remember, are friends with Russia because they don't like Germany. So basically, Alfred Schlieffen's prediction that there would be a war between Germany and France and Russia is true. The Schlieffen plan called for a quick strike against France, knock France out of the war quickly, and then turn German attention eastward towards Russia. The reasoning was it would take Russia 18 months to fully mobilize and get ready for war, so you had a little bit of time on the Eastern Front. But taking out France first, that was the goal, because Germany had done it once in the 1870s, so they would do it again in 1914. And in order to do this, you have to invade France at its northeastern edge, which means you have to invade through other countries, most notably Belgium, a neutral nation. And this is where Britain gets involved in the war, because Britain has a promise to protect Belgian neutrality. And German military leaders and political leaders, perhaps naively, believed that they could invade Belgium and strike at France, and that the United Kingdom, that Britain would not honor its agreement with Belgium. In fact, they said Britain would really go to war over that scrap of paper, their treaty of neutrality with Belgium. And so now Britain is in the war on the Entente side. So now it is France, Russia, and Britain, the three leading powers of the Entente, fighting against Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And Italy, although they're represented as a part of the Triple Alliance here, they're not going to enter the war just yet. They're going to remain neutral. And in 1915, they're going to switch to the Entente powers. So the Triple Alliance falls apart, but it's replaced by the Central Powers, the German Empire, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and also Bulgaria, too. Those are the Central Powers. It's easy to remember because they're kind of in the center of Europe. The Entente powers are France, Russia, Britain, and eventually Italy, and then, of course, after that, eventually the United States are the leaders of the Entente. And it's easy to remember because Entente is a French word, and France is on the Entente side. But everybody was hoping for a quick end to the war. The French wanted revenge, Germany wanted to take out France quickly, and there were beliefs that there would be victory by Christmas. This is an image of the young Bosnian nationalist Gavrilo Princip shooting the Archduke during his tour of Sarajevo. Sarajevo, by the way, is actually a Turkish word, which is why it sounds different than the names of other cities and towns in the region. The Ottoman Turks, remember, had once had an empire. They extended into the Balkans, and they'd moved their own people into the region. And here is another picture of Sarajevo at the time of the assassination of the Archduke. Here's a close-up of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You can see the many different ethnic groups that are a part of this empire. That's going to make it difficult for the Austro-Hungarian Empire to unify effectively during this conflict. You have Austrians, you have Hungarians, you have Transylvanians, you have Bohemians, who are generally called Czech or Czechoslovakians now, and then you have Bosnians, Herzegovinians, you have Albanians further to the south, and of course you have the Serbians or Serbs, who are a Slavic culture who were enemies of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but they were friends of Russia. So you can see how nationalism by these empires, their desire to grow their territories, and the nationalism of these ethnic groups who want their own nations, how it can be a motivating factor for this war. And this is an Australian cartoon. Australia being a part of the British Commonwealth, they're going to join the war as well. It's from 1915, so a little bit later, but it shows the British Kaiser kind of tricking the Ottoman Turks into joining this war. It's sort of a odd portrayal of the Kaiser and of the Ottoman Turks. The Turks are portrayed in what you might think of as a racially stereotypical manner, and the Kaiser is portrayed with, and often we would say it's sort of an anti-Semitic manner as well. The Germans are often portrayed using anti-Semitic stereotypes during World War I. You'll see some more examples later on in this video. This is a campaign map of the fighting in the Western Front in 1914. Germany pushed through Belgium because the ground is flatter. It's much easier for maneuvering large armies. They entered France, and they came very near to capturing Paris in the summer of 1914. But the French were also attacking to the east to threaten Germany as well. And as German troops moved through Belgium, they defeated the Belgian army fairly quickly, but they encountered pretty stiff resistance from Belgian civilians, Belgian insurgents and partisans, and they put down those insurgencies very, very aggressively, brutally, you might say. Some would call these atrocities and war crimes that were taking place in Belgium. But this rapid, mobile warfare, it turns into gridlock, it turns into trench warfare, as the new military technologies, machine guns, heavier artillery. Artillery caused the majority of casualties in World War I. And then new technologies like poison gas, flamethrowers, aircraft, zeppelins. All of these things will make the cavalry charges and in close ranks marches of the 19th century obsolete. The casualties will be appallingly high in the early months of this war, and really even into 1916. Military officers on both sides are struggling to adapt to the new technologies. They're trying to do things the way they had done them in the 1800s, the way things have been done in the Franco-Prussian War, and it just doesn't work. This is a roundup of the general course of the war pre-American entrance. Germany invades Belgium. It's part of the Schlieffen Plan to take out France quickly. They face a stiff Belgian insurgency, and there are reprisals against the Belgian civilians. These would be considered atrocities or war crimes. And they come very close to capturing Paris, but close but no cigar, and so the rapid fighting degenerates into trench warfare with 3,000 plus deaths per day. And Americans would have been keenly aware of what was happening in Europe. They could have read about it in the newspaper. They could have heard about it even in newsreels. This was not a conflict that they would have wanted to get involved in. As I said, Central Powers and Entente generals were still learning to adapt to the new technology, and American leaders, particularly President Woodrow Wilson, declared that this war was a waste of money, a waste of human lives and blood, and that America was too proud to enter the war. That was the kind of language he used, that America would instead be a neutral arbiter, a referee in this scrum that's taking place in Europe. And as I said, there's terrifying new technologies, aircraft, only about 10 years old, 11 years old, first used by the Germans militarily. Poison gas, first used by the Germans militarily as well. Tanks were first used by the British. U-boats and submarines, the Germans were leaders in submarine technology, even though the U.S. had also done some really important submarine research and work during the Civil War. And of course, artillery and machine guns had gotten to be much more powerful and much more efficient. So there's a lot of reasons why Americans would not want to enter this conflict. Also, America is a multi-ethnic state, and America is ethnically divided as well. There are groups in America that do not want to enter this war because it might mean potentially fighting against relatives or family. And this is a global conflict as well. It's not going to be as simple as just going to Europe. There is going to be fighting in Eastern Europe on the Eastern Front between Russia and the Central Powers. There's going to be fighting in the Mediterranean at places like Gallipoli, where the Anzac or Australian and New Zealand troops fight bravely but rather futilely against the Ottoman Empire. And there's going to be fighting in the Middle East, where the British are going to attempt to divide the ethnic groups of the Ottoman Empire, most notably the Arabs, away from the Ottoman Turks. There's also going to be promises of starting up a Jewish return to the Middle East as well during World War I with the Balfour Declaration. And then there's even fighting in sub-Saharan Africa. And of course there's fighting on the high seas as well. And seeing these horrors of warfare, President Wilson, as I said, he says that America is too proud to get involved in this war. But we're not really a neutral arbiter. Even though we didn't officially have our declaration of war until 1917, we were not truly neutral. We were on the side of the Entente. We had that special relationship with Great Britain. We were supplying Great Britain and supplying France with supplies. And the overall perception of Americans in that period, I would argue, was that Britain and France were more democratic than Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottomans, and it was better to support them than it was to support the Central Powers. And really, supporting the Central Powers would have been much more difficult anyway because German ports were blockaded by the British Navy. So American bankers, most notably people like J.P. Morgan Jr., are going to offer loans to the Entente powers, especially Britain and France, and they're going to make a lot of money. Like I said, it's completely false that people don't make money in these modern wars. There's plenty of ways to profit in modern war, not just arms dealers and manufacturers, but bankers as well. Even American farmers actually do really well in World War I. Their competition in Europe, on both, especially on the Entente side, is being conscripted, is being drafted. So now they're able to sell their grain and their food to the people of Europe, especially to the Entente. And really, food supply and bank loans, things of this nature, are going to keep the Entente powers going in this conflict. But as you can imagine, Germany is threatened by the United States' support of Britain and France in particular. And here this cartoon shows President Wilson looking on at Europe, and they're acting like a bunch of babies. This cartoon comes from later in the war with the release of the 14 points, but it's still illustrative of how President Wilson views the European empires and how everyday Americans view this great war. Here are some images related to the new military technologies, gas attacks. First, gas was used by the Germans. They used chlorine gas, which has a really, sort of sickly-looking green color. It will burn your eyes. It will burn your lungs. Gas mask technology has to be developed to protect soldiers' lungs, to protect their noses, their throats, and their eyes. Over time, new gases are developed, like mustard gas. It doesn't contain mustard. It's actually made of sulfur, but it has a yellowish color like mustard. And mustard gas is especially dangerous because it can settle in the ground, and you can walk over it or charge over it, and it will get kicked up into the air, and then it can start to get into your lungs and can kill you. Essentially, you'll asphyxiate yourself if you breathe in mustard gas, and chlorine gas will burn you the way chlorine bleach would burn your skin. And it's really frightening and horrendous. People have not seen anything like this before, so it's understandable that Americans see photographs. When they hear about the war, they're not going to want their countrymen to get involved. There are significant advances in aircraft technology as well, both fighter aircraft and bombers as well. And bombers will be used to attack enemy positions. There's even going to be bombings of cities like Paris and London during World War I. Not like the bombings you see during World War II, just because the aircraft is much more primitive. And really, when they're bombing London in World War I, they're primarily using Zeppelins or blimps. But again, it's just a reminder that this is a war in which not only are soldiers being killed and wounded, but civilians are being killed and wounded as well. And this is a Zeppelin blimp, like what the Germans would have used to bomb Britain in 1916. This is an image of some German soldiers practicing with a flamethrower or a Flammenwerfer. I believe this picture is from after 1916, based on the helmets they're wearing. They're wearing kind of the iconic German coal scuttle helmet that you're going to see them wear in the later years of World War I and then throughout World War II. It replaces the old-fashioned Prussian-German Pickelhaube helmet, it's called, which has the funny little point on top, which, believe it or not, that point actually has a tactical use. It was designed to protect the wearer's head from being struck by a sword by charging cavalry. But cavalry charges are out of style in World War I, or rather, they're just way too they're useless. Your cavalry will be cut down by machine guns. So there's a need for a helmet that provides better protection in other ways. And I often have students ask me, why were the Germans such good leaders when it comes to military technology? Why were they so prolific in things like poison gas, in aircraft, in U-boats, in flamethrowers and things of this nature? Is it because the Germans were uniquely evil? While many historians do say that the Germans bear the most responsibility for causing World War I and for escalating the conflict, the atrocities against Belgian civilians, for example, we generally argue that the Germans were so technologically and militarily advanced because of their educational system, particularly their university system, which the Germans were leaders of science and technology and engineering in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And many American universities, particularly universities that focused on history, like Johns Hopkins University, for example, they copied the German model of education. So really, it was education that allowed the Germans to have such a technological advantage. And here's an image of a German flamethrower going up against a British tank. And this is from the Battle of the Somme, 1916. And remember that the British were the leaders in tank development, although other powers, France, Germany, and eventually the US, will also make tanks too. This is it's called the German Paris gun. It's a railroad-mounted artillery piece that could target Paris. And this gun had an effective range of about 80 miles. So again, artillery technology is improving. Artillery is actually going to be the primary killer and causer of casualties in World War I. Here are young soldiers cheering on, saying, well, we'll see you in Paris. We're going to end this war quickly. Victory by Christmas. It wasn't victory by Christmas. This is the famous Christmas truce of 1914. It was an unofficial truce between Entente and Central Powers forces in the Western Front. During the Christmas truce, German and British and French soldiers left their trenches and walked towards no man's land. And they shook hands and they talked together. They shared food. They even played soccer or football, as they would call it in Europe. America, though, had not entered the war yet. If Americans had participated in the Christmas truce of 1914, they would have played baseball. And while some optimistic people might have hoped that the war would end with the 1914 Christmas truce and a mass strike of Entente and Central Powers troops, when Christmas was over, the fighting resumed again. And I want to remind everyone again that World War I is a global conflict. It's taking place across Europe and then across the world. And here are some images. This is T.E. Lawrence, an Englishman often known as Lawrence of Arabia, who fought the Ottoman Turks and made alliances with Arab nationalists in the region. Here are Turkish soldiers fighting at Gallipoli, and the Ottoman Turkish army really did a lot better than I think commentators at the time would have believed, considering the problems the Ottoman Empire had been facing for centuries, really, before the 20th century. And of course, the Ottoman Turks were also engaging in violence and atrocities against civilians on an even larger scale than the Germans. You have things like the Armenian genocide that takes place during this period in which at least 1 million Armenians and others were killed by the Ottoman Turks for their religious beliefs, for their ethnic culture, and for allegedly supporting the Russians. And we also have Russian soldiers. As I said, the war is being fought in Eastern Europe as well. And then you have, I think these are actually Russian soldiers from Georgia because of the pennants they're carrying. And we also have fighting in the Alps. These are Italian soldiers manning a machine gun. And these are African soldiers. They're actually German colonial African troops from Tanzania, which was an area where the Germans were trying to build their power. They're essentially the scramble for Africa and World War I are coming together. And France especially will use African colonial troops. We'll even have African colonial troops deployed in Europe. This is a 1916 New York World cartoon showing President Wilson trying to fight Kaiser Wilhelm. U-boat murder is written on the Kaiser's sword. But President Wilson is not fighting with a sword or with a gun. He's just using his bare hands. The idea is that the United States is trying to still be more peaceful than Germany. They're trying to escalate this fight rather than be too aggressive. And of course, this is an image of a German U-boat sinking an American ship. That American ships carried supplies to Europe to aid the Entente war effort, and also other European vessels. They carried supplies to and from the United States, and the Germans would target these vessels, and in some cases, even if the vessel did not have an American flag, there would still be Americans aboard, and they could be killed when the Germans sank these vessels. This is the sinking of the RMS Lusitania, which took place in 1915. This is a British vessel that was traveling across the Atlantic from New York to Great Britain, and the ship was British, but it was carrying American passengers, and there were over 1,000 deaths, about 1,200, and of those deaths, 139 were Americans who were killed. And the ship sunk very quickly. It was actually sunk by a U-boat called the U-28. There are suspicions, and not without reason, that this vessel was carrying weapons to help the Entente. It wasn't just carrying food or medicine or other supplies. And the Germans saw the support of these weapons being on this vessel, a British flag vessel, as justifying their sinking of this ship. That it was not really a neutral vessel, but Americans, most notably President Wilson, they condemned the sinking of the RMS Lusitania. And President Wilson basically told the Germans that if this unrestricted submarine warfare continues, the United States will have to respond and will have to retaliate. And in response to the sinking of the Lusitania and the American response, the threat of entering the war, Germany will scale back its policy of unrestricted warfare, at least temporarily. And President Wilson is very idealistic. He wants America to be a neutral arbiter. America, of course, is not really neutral. We are supporting the Entente with supplies and things like this. But President Wilson, he's aware it's 1915. Next year is an election year, and he needs to be very careful what he says or does because he doesn't want to hurt his re-election chances. As time goes on as well, German leaders in the German high command, they begin to come around to the idea that the U.S. is going to eventually join this war on the Entente powers side. And their goal essentially is just try to demoralize the other Entente powers and try to keep them from getting enough supplies that maybe the war can be ended before the U.S. has a chance to really make a difference in this conflict. This really is a very bold but very risky strategy on the Germans. They have to walk a fine line between allowing their enemies to get too much resupply from the United States, but not being too aggressive with their U-boats that the United States enters the war too quickly. So now we'll turn to American domestic politics, the 1916 election specifically. Wilson had the advantages of being an incumbent president, but he does have some weaknesses as well. This war is complex, and you have to be careful too to avoid doing anything that could escalate the conflict or needlessly drag the United States into the war. And Wilson's key slogan was, "He kept us out of war." They put it on signs, they put it on trucks, and it resonates with many Americans. It's going to resonate with pacifists and socialists who oppose this war. Pacifists oppose the war because they're anti-war and anti-violence. Socialists oppose the war because they don't want the working class of America fighting against the working class of Germany. They instead want revolution, international revolution, the working class around the world rising up against the upper class. Also, America is ethnically divided as well. Irish American voters are a strong Democrat voter bloc, but you don't want to alienate part of your base because they may show up. They may not show up on voting day, or they might, potentially cross the aisle and vote for the other side. German American voters are also a very powerful voter bloc too, and the Germans are not as committed to the Democratic Party as the Irish are. But of course, the Germans don't want to fight Germany. They don't want to fight against their motherland, their fatherland, and the Irish don't want to fight against Germany either because that would mean fighting on the same side as the British. And the Irish in America don't like the British. There's plenty of reasons going back for hundreds of years why the Irish don't like the British. And earlier that year, in Easter of 1916, the British had really brutally suppressed a attempted Irish uprising in it's called the Easter Uprising, and the Germans had actually tried to supply the Irish revolutionaries with weapons and things like that. So to join the war on the Entente side would be to ally with Britain, and that was interpreted as being an anti-Irish thing to many Irish Americans. I should add, though, that there were Irish people that did fight on the Entente side during World War I in the British Army, because Ireland was still a part of the British Empire at this point. Domestically, for the Republicans, they choose Charles Hughes of New York. He was the former governor of New York, and he's also a Supreme Court justice as well. And Republicans condemned Wilson for not doing enough to prepare America for war. That if America had been more prepared for war, then perhaps Germany would not be attacking American ships. And basically, to prepare for peace, you must prepare for war. That was the argument made by people like Teddy Roosevelt, who was a important kind of campaign surrogate in the 1916 U.S. election. He'd run for president in 1912 as a third party bull moose progressive, but he's working for the Republicans again in 1916. And progressives in America, this is the progressive era, they're torn about what to do about this great war. The more radical progressives, the socialists, the pacifists, they don't want to enter the war for the reasons I mentioned before. But a lot of just more garden variety progressives in America thought that going to war would be ungentlemanly, it would be dishonorable. America needs to be this neutral referee. We need to be better than the old empires of Europe that get dragged into these wasteful conflicts. Also, focusing on war is going to take time and energy and money away from social programs and progressive era legislation and agendas. Anyway, it is a close election. Wilson does lead in the popular vote, but it's extremely close in the Electoral College, and it really came down to California. California was won by Wilson by less than 4,000 votes, and had he lost California, he would have lost this election. I don't think it would have made a tremendous difference. I think it's very likely that the United States would have gone to war anyway. But anyway, Wilson was able to run on his anti-war, he kept us out of war message, and then he wins his re-election. And the American people, they wanted to stay out of this war. But of course, we all know what happens. Wilson will call for war on April 6th, 1917, shortly after his second term began. He's no longer, in the words of a modern former president, he had more flexibility after the election. And I do think the Republican criticism was fair, that perhaps had the United States had a larger military and been more prepared for a possible conflict, Germany may not have enacted unrestricted submarine warfare. They might have been too afraid to do so. This is the Easter Uprising in 1916. Irish revolutionaries wanting independence, they barricaded themselves in a post office in Ireland. They were defeated and then captured and executed. And many Irish people in Ireland, of course, were upset about this, but so were Irish people in America. The United States enters World War I officially in April of 1917. The previous month, in March, the Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, stepped down from the throne. He abdicated because of mounting pressure from the immensely unpopular First World War in Russia. Russia was facing strikes. They were facing shortfalls in troops, and the Russian people were beginning to go on strike, and the Tsar attempted to restore order violently, and that led to increased resistance to his rule, and he ultimately elected to abdicate, and he also abdicated for his son as well, because his son had really a serious illness, hemophilia, and was too young and too sick to be the next ruler of Russia. And in doing so, he ended the Romanov dynasty and what is called the Tsarist rule of Russia. In the place of the Tsar, a new government was established, the Provisional Government of Russia. The idea was the Provisional Government would be a placeholder until a more democratic system could be established. And the abdication of the Tsar, it gave the Wilson administration additional moral force behind calling for a declaration of war, because now America really was making the world safe for democracy. The leading powers on the Entente side, Britain, a constitutional monarchy, France, a republic, and now Russia, a country that's moving in a more democratic direction. Now the United States is joining the democratic side in the First World War. They're fighting against the autocratic Ottoman Empire, the autocratic Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the somewhat autocratic German Empire, although there are certain things that German people could vote on. But again, it gives moral weight to the United States entering World War I. Wilson was an idealist. His moral foreign policy was based on idealism, and this was just as important as having gone through the 1916 election, no longer having that pressure. It's just as important as German attacks on American shipping and submarine warfare. There has to be an ideal, there has to be a moral to inspire the U.S. to enter this war. Unfortunately, though, things do get more complicated. The Germans support Vladimir Lenin. They help him leave his exile in Switzerland and return to Russia. They allow him safe passage through their territory. And they did this because the Russian government, really Russian society, was in disarray. The various governments of the Russian cities, or Soviets as they were called, they were disagreeing with each other about how the country should be run. The provisional government was attacked from both the political right and the political left, and adding in Lenin would create chaos in Russia. Lenin was a communist, and he was backed by a group called the Bolsheviks. They were the most extreme and radical communists. There were other less radical left-wing groups like the Mensheviks, but ultimately the Bolsheviks are going to emerge as the most powerful faction in Russian politics, and by November of 1917 they will take control of the Russian government. And in early 1918, Lenin, now the leader or the premier of Russia, now transitioning into the Soviet Union, he is going to withdraw Russia from the First World War. And as he withdraws Russia from the First World War, he will sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which saw Russia sign away large amounts of its western territory, places like what is now Belarus, the Ukraine, parts of other countries as well, Poland, parts of Finland, parts of the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire are going to take these territories, which has led some people to say that there was a quid pro quo arrangement between Lenin and the Germans, although the evidence for this is very circumstantial at best. What Lenin was really trying to do was get Russia out of this war, because the war was extremely destructive and it was not supported by the Russian people. And he also wanted to consolidate his own power, because the Bolsheviks may be the dominant force in Russian politics, but they're still fighting against other factions. The Bolsheviks and their allies are going to be called the Red Russians, and they're going to fight the supporters of the Tsar, the White Russians, in the Russian Civil War that's going to last into the 1920s. Speaking of German political intrigues in other countries, in early 1917, British agents intercept a German telegram communique that was encrypted, secret code that was sent to Mexico to the government of Venustiano Carranza, the constitutionalist faction that was emerging as the winning faction in the Mexican Revolution. That faction originally had been supported by the Wilson administration, by the United States, but as time went on, they began to break away from this U.S. support for reasons I discussed in a different video. In this telegram, Arthur Zimmermann, the German diplomat who sent it, he said that Germany was preparing to begin unrestricted submarine warfare again, and this would likely lead the United States to declaring war on Germany, although they hoped that America would continue to remain neutral. It was a delicate balance of how much shipping could Germany destroy, how many Americans could die, could be killed without the United States entering the war. And they announced that if the United States went to war against Germany, Mexico should go to war against the United States, and in exchange, Mexico would receive the states of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, those states being formerly a part of Mexico back in the 19th century. And The Mexican government refused this offer, seeing it as unworkable. There were too many Anglo-Americans in those southwestern states. And the Carranza government, although they were winning in the Russian Revolution, there were still other factions that they were fighting against, and they were still working on consolidating their power. So this offer was rejected by Mexico. But when it became public, it angered and enraged Americans that Germany was again trying to intervene in Mexican affairs or interfere in Mexican affairs in a way that was damaging to the United States, as they had done in previous years or have been rumored to have been doing in previous years. The Huerta government earlier in the Russian Revolution was said to be receiving weapons from Germany, for example, and Germany had been trying to build up its influence in Latin America and the Caribbean. And this, of course, was a violation of the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which said that Europe should keep out of Latin American and Caribbean affairs, and because the United States should be the hegemon in this region. But the Zimmerman telegram and the announcement of unrestricted submarine warfare beginning, these angered the American people, they angered President Wilson, and they will give the immediate reason that the United States will declare war on Germany, alongside the changes in administration and government in Russia, which gave the United States a moral legitimacy in entering this war, again under Woodrow Wilson's idealistic, moral foreign policy and making the world safe for democracy. This is a quick roundup of the U.S. entrance into World War I and the events that preceded it. Unrestricted German submarine warfare or U-boat warfare was targeting American and British shipping, and U.S. citizens were dying and U.S. property was being destroyed, most notably in the sinking of the RMS Lusitania, a British ship that was carrying American passengers, and 139 Americans were killed in this event. And the Lusitania was likely carrying weapons for the Entente as well. And America really showed a remarkable amount of forbearance in not going to war with Germany sooner over this unrestricted submarine warfare, over American citizens being killed. The United States had gone to war against other countries for far less, particularly against Great Britain in the War of 1812, in which the British were pressing American sailors into the British Navy, forcing them against their will to serve in the British Navy, and stopping American ships on the high seas, which was a threat to American national sovereignty. But the amount of American lives that were being lost in these impressments was far lower than what was happening with the Germans sinking these supply ships and transatlantic vessels. Germany did scale back its submarine warfare after the Lusitania, after President Wilson said there would be consequences if they didn't. But the German strategy really relied on stopping shipping of supplies from America to the Entente powers in Western Europe. Germany needed to bleed Britain and France dry in order for its strategy to be successful, which essentially you're counting on stopping all those supplies using U-boats and doing it in a way that's not going to cause the United States to enter the war because Americans are dying. It's a bold but risky strategy, and perhaps an unworkable strategy. Yes, Germany does have a powerful military and powerful military technology, but there's certain factors that are in some ways beyond their control. And they really have to walk a tightrope when it comes to these attacks on American shipping, and they fail to do so. The United States does enter this war, and they enter the war after learning that unrestricted submarine warfare is going to begin again, after learning that Germany is trying to entice Mexico into going to war with the United States, and they also enter the war for moral reasons as well, because Russia begins to move in a more democratic direction after the abdication of the Tsar. President Wilson really can say that America is making the world safe for democracy by entering this conflict. And during this period leading up to war, and then certainly after the war, anti-German sentiment is increasing in the United States, and this turns into anti-immigrant sentiment as well in general. Um, Immigration laws are tightened during this period. You see this with the 1917 Immigration Act, which um, basically banned all immigration from outside of Europe, and it also required literacy tests for European immigrants. The idea was immigrants who are literate are more likely to be educated, and they're less likely to be bringing dangerous radical ideologies like communism, socialism, or anarchism into the country. And just some examples of rising anti-German sentiment. In the United States, Germans could be deported or arrested. There were cases of violence against German people living in the country. Hutterites, who are a group of German pacifists, a lot like the Amish, so they're pacifists, they don't support Germany's war. They were lynched out west because they were German. They typically had long beards. It's part of their religion, but they were sort of a dangerous other, and so they faced violence. In addition, one of my colleagues studied anti-German, anti-Semitic sentiment in World War I domestically. He actually researched German Jewish bandage sellers who were itinerant, who traveled around America, and they were often harassed and treated very badly because there was a fear that they were possibly spreading disease or almost like biological weapons in the United States. And this anti-German sentiment got to be so bad that they were changing the name of hamburgers to the Liberty Sandwich because hamburger sounded too much like Hamburg, a town in Germany. They changed the name of sauerkraut to Liberty Cabbage, again, to make it sound more American. And German shepherds were called Alsatian shepherds because German names, German terms were seen as unpatriotic. But America is now in the war. President Wilson is promising to make the world safe for democracy. He is promising peace without victory, that we are going to end this war. We're not going to trample on Germany. And we're going to teach the old empires of Europe a lesson about American democracy and liberty, although in many ways liberty was curtailed in the United States during World War I. So how did the U.S. build up its military to prepare for deployment in Europe? Well, you'll remember that up till 1917, the U.S. generally had a very small standing army compared to the United States' geographic size, the United States' population, and the United States economy. In fact, there were only about 150,000 troops in the regular U.S. Army at the time of the U.S. entrance into the war, and there were only about 180,000 troops in the National Guard, most of whom were deployed on the U.S.-Mexican border. And in the weeks since the declaration of war on April 6, only about 73,000 volunteers joined up, highlighting the ambivalence towards the war amongst many Americans. Thus, a draft was needed. And America had had drafts before this point, such as during the Civil War, and drafts were very controversial in America. So instead of calling it a draft, it's called the Selective Service Act, and it's put into effect on May 18th. 24 million American men. Initially, it was men 18 to 30, and then by the summer of 1918, it's men 18 to 45. They must register for the draft. Of the 24 million that register, 6.4 million will actually be called up for service, and then about 4.2 million will join the Army. In the end, only about 3 million will see active duty. Within these numbers, there are about 370,000 African Americans, and there were about 20% of the draftees were foreign-born. America's only got about a 15% foreign-born or immigrant population, meaning that immigrants actually are overrepresented amongst the draftees, which is really interesting to see considering the rising xenophobia that was expanding during World War I. In addition, Puerto Rican males also could be drafted as they'd become citizens in 1917, and non-citizens in the process of becoming citizens would have to register for the draft as well. Now, there were ways to defer your service. If you were serving in an essential industry, for example, such as weapons manufacturing, if you had children, you could receive a deferment. Certainly medical deferments as well. And then conscientious objectors, however, they could still be drafted. Someone who objected to the war on religious grounds, they could still be drafted, but they could be assigned to non-combat roles, such as medics, cooks, things of that nature. And men who did not carry draft cards, or who resisted the draft, or who went on strike during the war, they would be called slackers, and they could be harassed by law enforcement or arrested. They could also be harassed by a civilian organization called the American Protective League, the APL. And the image on this slide is of U.S. National Guardsmen in 1917 from New York, and then the poster on the side of the slide is a Colorado draft poster. This is a photograph of my maternal great-grandfather. His name was Lyman Bowman Sr., and he was from Pine Castle, Florida, and he was an older recruit. He was in his 40s, so he would have been part of that later group of draftees that went up to age 45. And he never saw service in Europe. The war ended before he could be shipped to Europe, but he did go to Virginia for training. He was a medic. And I don't believe he was a medic because he was a conscientious objector. I haven't seen any evidence to back that up. I believe it was primarily because of his age. It's an interesting photograph. He has his collar turned up, his hands in his pockets, not proper military discipline. It highlights that he's a man who's serving his country on his own terms. Also, you should keep in mind that many of my ancestors, including the Bowman family, were from Germany. And the Bowmans, their original name was actually Baumann. They anglicized it once they came here, although they'd been in the country since the 1850s. And Lyman Bowman Sr. here was born in the United States. But now we'll get back to our discussion of mobilization of the American public in World War I. The young, able-bodied American male population has been mobilized for military service through the Selective Service Act, and the media also is going to play a role in mobilizing the American people as well to, one, not resist the draft or to voluntarily serve in the military, but two, to work in defense industries, to buy war bonds, to do other types of service like growing victory gardens. And these propaganda and mobilization campaigns, they're going to target Americans from a variety of backgrounds: men, women, even children, immigrants, and they're going to encourage Americans to serve and do their part in a variety of ways. And this is where George Creel comes in. He was a journalist from Colorado. He was I would class him as a progressive journalist, as within the muckraker category. And he's going to head up the Committee on Public Information, and the press is going to be it's not going to be fully censored in World War I, but the Committee on Public Information is going to control the information that's coming out of Europe that the press will then put into their newspapers. In addition, the CPI is going to educate people to explain why America is fighting this war, why Americans should sign up for the draft, why they should buy war bonds. These are called the 4-Minute Men. This is very much a progressive era policy of education and training people to go out and actually convince everyday Americans to go along with this war, because the progressives were all about education. They were all about activism and political engagement. That's exactly what the 4-Minute Men did. And they were called that because they could give a 4-minute speech about a variety of topics to get Americans to support the war. This is also important as well because progressives are divided actually as a group. There are progressives that support the American war effort. Current progressive president Woodrow Wilson supports the war effort. Former U.S. President and progressive Teddy Roosevelt supports the war effort, but some of the more radical and fringe progressives, people like Eugene Debs, people like Robert La Follette Sr. even, they oppose the war because it's expensive, it would distract from other progressive era policies, and then in the case of the really radical sort of edge fringe progressives, the socialists, they don't want this war because they don't want to see American workers fighting against German workers. They want revolution around the world. And the pacifist progressives also don't support the war effort because they see war as a waste and even a sinful thing. These are some examples of the mobilization or propaganda posters that are developed during the World War I years. When we hear the word propaganda, it's kind of like when we hear the word empire. It has negative connotations, and there's good reasons for why propaganda has negative connotations, just as there's good reasons why the term empire or imperialism has negative meanings to us. But to academic historians, the term propaganda means mobilizing the people, gathering them together ideologically, using information that can be true or in some cases exaggerated, or through in some cases even deception. So these are some examples of what you might call good propaganda. The famous Uncle Sam, I Want You poster, which we've seen in many wars, even after World War I. And Uncle Sam had been portrayed in this manner before World War I, but it's a really dynamic image of Uncle Sam directly looking at the viewer. It was actually modeled after British posters featuring the King making a similar gesture to get British men to join the British military. The United States is also personified by Columbia as well, who is represented as a young, attractive, and physically fit woman, and that you're going to be protecting America as a woman as well. So sometimes America is represented as a man, sometimes America is represented as a woman. They often play to the period's ideas of gender and even what you might call gender anxieties, that American men must protect women just as they protect America. And these posters come in a variety of styles. Some are designed to get men to join the military. Others are designed to get people to buy bonds. They often do have what we might call sex appeal. They feature attractive women, that you're protecting women by buying these bonds. There's a gendered element to these propaganda campaigns. They even target children with some of these campaigns. Here's one for featuring a young child, a young girl presumably, who has received a bond as a birthday present, perhaps. Kids, don't ask for birthday or Christmas presents. Ask your parents to buy you bonds instead. It's better for the American war effort, and it's something that you can have for years to come, and you can support your country. Women are also targeted in these ads as well. Join the American Red Cross. Women have a part to play in this war as well. And then there's other ways that you can serve. You can grow a victory garden. The extra food that you grow means we don't have to, we can send more food to Europe, and we can support our allies in Europe. The American food industry is going to be mobilized and regulated in new ways during World War I. There also are propaganda campaigns that target immigrants as well. Remember the flag of liberty, support it, buy bonds, reminding first-generation Americans and perhaps even immigrants that this country has accepted them and that they ought to support their new home, even though in many cases immigrants and first-generation Americans, ethnic Americans, were facing increasing prejudice during this period. This is a poster here as well. It's in Spanish. It says, I'm not a native Spanish speaker, but it says your Liberty bonds, they'll help put an end to this. And you see German in their old-fashioned pointed Pickelhaube helmet, He is crucifying what looks like either an American or a British soldier, and that you're going to stop these war crimes by buying war bonds because America's military will be stronger, and they'll be able to stop the Germans from doing these barbaric things, which the Germans did make many attacks on civilians and commit war crimes in Belgium, for example. But these propaganda posters, they mix fact and fiction. They try to inflame people's emotions to get them to support America, but to be angry with Germany, and motivates them to support the country in a variety of ways. There's positives to propaganda of, bringing people together against a common struggle, but there's negatives as well in how the enemy is portrayed. And here is the dark side, or the negative, of these propaganda campaigns. The Germans are denigrated, dehumanized even. These posters portray them as violent, dirty, disheveled, unshaven, uncivilized threats. They're portrayed almost as not being white in the same way that Anglo-Americans are. It's interesting what they do with race and ethnicity in these propaganda posters. The Germans are described as being the Huns. It's a reference to the ancient Huns, a Central Asian nomadic culture that attacked the Roman Empire and were very destructive. It also, I think, is a reference to the Austro-Hungarian Empire as well. So you're kind of, lumping multiple groups together in a rather ethnocentric way. But the Germans are also portrayed in a almost subhuman manner. They're portrayed with beady eyes, blood on their hands. This image on the left portrays Germany as a guerrilla kidnapping vulnerable women. Again, gender norms come up in these propaganda campaigns. And the last image here on the bottom left hand side of the slide shows German portrayed in a very anti-Semitic manner, classically anti-Semitic manner, which a lot of the anti-German propaganda featured an anti-Jewish element because there were many Jewish people in Germany, and there were many German Jewish people in America as well. And here are some images related to dissent suppression domestically in the United States. You have the American Protective League, founded in 1917. It was a civilian organization, but its agents carried badges, and they swore oaths that they would protect the country, and they would stop and arrest people that were slacking, not being signed up for the draft, avoiding the draft, or that were trying to organize labor strikes. Here you can see potential slackers being arrested. The APL would work with local law enforcement, and they would go to billiard halls. They'd go to anywhere where men would congregate that wasn't their workplace, and they would make sure that they had their draft cards and that they'd signed up for the draft. In news reports, they mentioned going to places like bathhouses and chop suey joints, Chinese restaurants. So there's the idea that maybe if you're eating Chinese food, maybe perhaps they're targeting immigrants possibly, or people who are not native-born Americans. Perhaps there are also maybe there's a homophobic element to this, targeting bathhouses, places where people are bathing instead of working. But this is the language that comes up in the press during this period. And here's a xenophobic cartoon featuring the German Kaiser and a general threat from non-American people coming into the country. And here is a strike being broken up by the APL in Arizona. This strike was actually organized by the IWW, the Wobblies, who were a very much more radical union with much more socialist leanings that did not support the American war effort. In this video, you've probably begun to notice that cracks and fissures are beginning to emerge in the progressive movement in America. Divisions are beginning over how to handle the First World War. And in some historians in their textbooks, they end the Progressive Era in 1917 when America enters World War One. I don't do that because I think the Progressive Era continues on through World War One. Yes, the movement does have some divisions, but it also, in some ways, reaches new heights during this war as well. And here are some examples. The 19th Amendment of 1920, which is after the war, it gives women the right to vote nationwide. It was greatly facilitated by the service that women did for the country, in the Red Cross or by working in factories and in farms. That way more men could join the military. Other things as well, like higher taxes, particularly higher income taxes, they are going to be passed in order to raise revenue for World War One. The U.S. Had been enacting income taxes, full income taxes in 1913 after the 16th Amendment, and the taxes initially were very, very low. And the taxes are going to be drastically raised during World War One. We're talking about 70% tax rate on the wealthiest Americans, and really everybody's going to be paying more taxes in World War One. The progressives saw taxes as a way to raise revenue, and they saw taxes as a way to close wealth disparities. And this 70% tax on the wealthy is going to do just that. But at the same time, the progressive movement is also encountering some division as well. There's a division over prohibition of alcohol, which is being accelerated by World War One. There are resource shortages. There are pushes to regulate the food industry, another progressive goal. But there are progressives that really want to have prohibition to help ensure women gain the right to vote. They're doing it also because there is a anti-immigrant sentiment in prohibition as well. But progressives are also becoming increasingly divided over the mobilization for World War One. They view this mobilization, while it is a organization of the American people, it is a threat to the liberties of everyday Americans. It's rather undemocratic, and so some progressives oppose the mass mobilization of the American people. And there are progressives who also do not want America to go to war. There are progressives also who are going to support the Russian Revolution. The United States opposed the Russian Revolution because the Russian Revolution, especially after Lenin takes control of the country, it's going to lead Russia to leave the war. And examples of this is Eugene Debs, who I've mentioned before, as well as even more middle of the road progressives like Robert La Follette Sr. They're going to find themselves increasingly marginalized in the progressive movement. And President Woodrow Wilson, who was a anti-big business and pro-organized labor progressive, he's going to have to make some compromises with business leaders. In some ways, the American economy is going to be very centrally managed during World War One to meet the needs of the American military and the needs of our allies. At the same time, though, Wilson is going to have to work with business leaders in ways that a lot of progressives would not have wanted to do before the war. For example, his Treasury Secretary, William Gibbs McAdoo, who was a very standard progressive, he's going to have to work with people like Henry Ford, of the Ford Motor Company. He's going to have to work with financiers like Bernard Baruch, again, another type of person that the progressives are not going to like. And these industrialists are going to work to create the War Industries Board, or the WIB. So there's going to be some central management from the U.S. government, but there are going to be some compromises being made with big business. Strikes are going to be suppressed. These business leaders are going to have an input on how the U.S. government is going to conduct its gathering of supplies. So in many ways, the progressive movement has a lot of really important gains because of World War One. But then at the same time, the movement is going to be divided, and in some ways, it's like a balloon. It's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then it's going to pop. Here are the exact details about taxes and regulations for World War I. The Revenue Act of 1917 drastically increased tax rates, something that the progressives had wanted for a long time. Those making over $2 million a year, about $50 million today, they're going to be paying 67%, so about 70%, like I said before. The Volstead Act, remember, it bans alcohol. It's wartime prohibition acts brought on by food shortages, resource shortages. It's going to facilitate prohibition after the war as much as the women's movement struggle against alcohol helps to bring prohibition along. And as I said, there was a xenophobic element to prohibition too. Um, in America, there was no rationing of food the way you had in Europe during World War I. We're not going to ration food until World War II, but there were strict regulations put on the food supply in America, particularly on things like flour and meat. The idea was we were going to encourage conservation, and then we can ship extra food to Europe. Americans were even encouraged to save things like peach pits, because these peach pits can be used to make filters for gas masks. And the food board is going to regulate the food industry, and it's going to discourage waste. It's going to be led by a engineer and a progressive leader named Herbert Hoover. And you can see a picture of him on this slide. He is going to oversee the food board. And taxes and regulation of food had been major progressive goals going back to the initial income tax and the Pure Food and Drug Act before World War I. And I'll unpack labor and strikes a bit more in World War I. The labor movement in America, broadly speaking, was divided in World War I. Some of the more conservative unions, like the AFL, led by Samuel Gompers, they supported the war. They saw the war as an opportunity to grow the American Industrial Center and to have better jobs for American workers, and also as young men are leaving the workforce, that means there's going to be more jobs for the Americans that are staying behind at home. More radical groups like the IWW, the Wobblies, they're going to oppose the war. Radicals, socialists, they don't want working class Americans fighting against working class Germans, as I've mentioned before. And the Russian Revolution is going to make this situation even more complex, as American socialists are going to sympathize with the Soviet Union that is developing, that is now removed from the war. It's no longer an ally, and also Russia has signed over large amounts of territory to Germany as well. The Wilson administration, which had been pro-labor, had supported striking workers before the war. It's going to support strike suppression now because it has to keep the war industries going. And that's going to, again, even as progressives are gaining many things because of World War I, they're also being divided as well. And it's going to contribute to their ultimate collapse after the war. And this is a cartoon showing organized labor being paid off by the Germans. With the time that we have left in this video, we're going to turn to the operational military history of the U.S. involvement in World War I. We'll talk about how the United States gets its troops and supplies to Europe, and then the effect that the U.S. deployment in Europe will have on the conclusion of the war. So the American Expeditionary Force, led by General John Pershing, they actually arrive on 4th of July 1917, but the United States does not have troops deployed in Europe in large numbers until early 1918. It's about, you'll have about 3 million will be deployed in Europe by May of 1918. And the German U-boats are attacking American ships. Initially, there's a push to get supplies and troops to Europe as quickly as possible, so American transatlantic transports will sail as quickly as they can across the sea, and they'll be picked off by German U-boats. As time goes on, the United States develops the convoy system, where transports, supply ships, and cargo ships, they'll be guarded by destroyers, which are naval vessels designed specifically to search out and destroy U-boats. Sonar was actually developed by the British in World War I, but the U.S. is not really going to use sonar until World War II. But the United States will use technologies like painting their vessels with all of these stripes here. These are actually a form of camouflage that would make it very difficult for a German submarine or U-boat using a periscope to gauge how far away the American ship is. It kind of messes with their points of reference. And some historians argue the development of this convoy system where large groups of ships will wait and then go together, and then they'll have to travel more slowly if they're part of a convoy. But this system is reminiscent of the wagon trains that Americans used when they crossed the American West in the 1800s, and it's kind of a part of our frontier legacy. There may be some truth to that, but this is also happening at sea as well. It's not happening on the Great Plains. So American troops are arriving in the summer of 1917, but it's the spring of 1918 when things really begin to heat up for the United States in Europe. Germany is transferring its armies from the Eastern Front. Russia has now exited the war, led by Lenin, and the Germans are really, what they're trying to do is they're trying to crush France and end this war before the United States gets too heavily involved, because once the United States is fully deployed in Europe, it's curtains for Germany. Now they don't have the human resources, the manpower to defeat the Entente, and the Entente is getting supplies from the United States as well. So this will lead to the spring and summer of 1918, the last German offensive. The Germans are going to advance, and they're going to nearly capture Paris again, but they're going to be stopped in part by the U.S. military, the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Marine Corps at Chateau Thierry and Belleau Wood. And American troops on the whole were comparatively inexperienced. Some may have had some training in the National Guard. Some may have been to Mexico during the Punitive Expedition, but they don't have the kind of experience that the British and French troops have. They're actually called doughboys, and they're called Sammies as well. And these are names that are kind of a reference to the youthfulness and perhaps the naivete, but the vigor of American troops. We also think the term doughboy may have arisen because of dusty uniforms. Soldiers getting all dusty after marching through, along dirt roads or after being in the mud of a trench. But the British and the French soldiers, it was a massive morale boost to have the American troops there with them fighting in Europe. Even if the American troops were inexperienced, there was a vigor about them that kind of encouraged the French and the British to keep fighting. And this last German offensive, it will fail, and it will allow the Entente to instead counterattack in the Meuse-Argonne region of northeast France in the fall of 1918, and that is where World War I will come to an end. As I mentioned before, American women served both at home in the United States and abroad. There was a significant need for nurses to take care of the sick and the wounded, both in France and back in the United States. Nursing could be a very hazardous job, particularly if you're in a forward operating aid station, as was the case for Nurse Helen Fairchild at the top right of this slide, who was killed while taking care of wounded troops. Also, African American and Native American women served as nurses as well, along with white women. And there's especially going to be a need for healthcare workers as the Spanish influenza pandemic begins to take hold during the final months of World War I. Native Americans as a whole served in World War I as well. Although they did not have citizenship, they volunteered for service in the U.S. military. This is 1917. A generation earlier, there were still Native American tribes that were fighting against the United States. But now Native Americans are looking to have a better life, and prove that they are strong, that they are capable, and looking to get away from the reservation system, the assimilation systems the United States has established, and military service for some provides that route. And Native Americans, of course, had a long military tradition and what we might call a warrior culture, and I mean that in a very positive way. Members of the Choctaw tribe, for example, they will use their language to send coded messages during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, contributing to the Entente victory. These young soldiers, they would have gone through the boarding schools on the reservations where they could be punished if they spoke their indigenous language. They could have their mouths washed out with soap or any kind of other punishments, but they used their own language and their own culture to develop codes that the Germans could not understand. The Germans could understand English, they could understand other languages, but Choctaw was unfamiliar to the Germans. So these Choctaw code talkers, you might call them, they are going to play a major role in ensuring the American victory in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. And you'll see Native Americans doing similar types of work with their languages in World War II as well. And I do believe that the service rendered by Native Americans to the U.S. war effort in World War I, it will contribute to the push for Native American citizenship in 1924. And the bottom image of this slide is of some of these Choctaw soldiers, and the top image is of a woman who was actually from one of the First Nations of Canada, but she served in the U.S. military. So we'll turn back to some critical battles that the United States took part in World War I. I'll mention Belleau Wood first. In June of 1918, the German troops were heavily dug in at Belleau Wood, and the U.S. Marines advanced and charged on their position, facing significant casualties. Famous Marine officer Dan Daly, he shouted to his comrades, "Come on, you SOBs, do you want to live forever?" Although he didn't say SOBs. After 6 really tough, tenacious charges, the Marines, with assistance from the French and the British, they're going to dislodge the Germans from their position, and the Germans are going to call them Teufelhunden, or Devil Dogs, which is where the U.S. Marine Corps gets that nickname that it still uses today. And this battle, Belleau Wood, it really solidifies the U.S. Marine Corps' reputation as a premier fighting force for the United States around the world. I mean, the Marines had done some really amazing things in earlier wars, but now other countries are really starting to notice this. And this is Dan Daly, multiple Medal of Honor recipient. Here is just a map of the heavily wooded fortifications that the Germans had at Belleau Wood, and then just the toll that's left behind of this battle. And by the way, Dan Daly was of Irish ancestry, yet he bravely served in the U.S. Marine Corps. He didn't have his Irish ethnicity did not stop him from being a loyal and patriotic American. This is the Battle of Chateau Thierry, and at this battle, the U.S. troops are really going to stop the German spring counteroffensive, and this was a battle not so much of trench warfare, but of street-to-street fighting, more like what you might see in the Second World War. And African American troops of the USCT will play a major role in stopping the German advance and then counterattacking and beginning to push the Germans back. And initially, although African Americans were drafted into the U.S. Army, the U.S. military did not want to have African Americans in combat positions, and it kept African Americans in segregated units. But other countries, namely France, they had no qualms about sending African American U.S. troops into combat. The French had a long tradition of using colonial troops from Africa in combat. And here are some scenes from the Chateau Thierry battle to illustrate the really brutal street-to-street fighting that the United States is going to engage in. So how did the U.S. soldiers interact with European civilians and with their Entente comrades? Really, this is the first time in American history that Americans, native-born Americans, have an opportunity to visit Europe. Um, this is a period before inexpensive air travel. Middle-class people did not travel outside of the United States for vacations and things like that. If you were traveling, it was for business reasons, or because you were in the military, or because you were a sailor or in some profession like that. So you now have 3 million Americans who visit Europe. So there's going to be some interesting cultural exchanges that are going to take place. And generally, Americans had a positive relationship with French civilians. The French thought that Americans had some unusual customs. They thought it was unusual that Americans would bathe in freezing cold rivers, even in the middle of winter. You know, they're trying to follow military regulations for hygiene and things like that. Um, Black soldiers sometimes encountered racism during their service, but generally what they're encountering is far less severe than what they would have seen in the American South. And of course, cultural differences and language barriers can lead to some tensions. But on the whole, I think these cultural exchanges were pretty good. American soldiers were often called doughboys or Sammies because of their youthfulness, because of their lack of experience, possibly because of their uniforms getting dirty. Sometimes they're called Yanks as well, particularly by the British, although Southern soldiers really did not like being called Yanks. They think of that as being just what you call Yankees, people from the Northeast. And there are some interesting experiences, particularly that African American soldiers have. Some wonder if perhaps things will change in America after this war comes to an end. Here are African American soldiers performing in France. I really like that the one in the center is wearing roller skates as he's dancing. As I mentioned, many African American soldiers still face challenges in France, but they found that French society was less segregated than the American South was, and there was an opportunity to see what life was like, not having to worry about some of those restrictions. And there's a hope among some African Americans that this war might lead to social change back home in the United States. And that's a sentiment that you're really going to see after World War II. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive of September through November 1918 was the last major battle of the war. Um, this was a battle that was fought primarily by the French and by the U.S. Their goal was to cut off German supply lines, particularly rail lines in northeastern France, and then force them out of France and then prepare for a invasion of Germany. And the German forces were well fortified along the Hindenburg Line, and there's very dense forests in this region as well. It's a place where advances are going to be very difficult, as you can see in this image of American machine gunners at right. And the United States will advance on German positions. The Germans will counterattack. And then they could, in some cases, be surrounded by the Germans, and then they would have to continue fighting in order to be relieved by other U.S. troops advancing. And it's in the Meuse-Argonne offensive that you're really going to see the United States get to experiment with new military technologies, namely tanks and aircraft. And during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, you're going to see many famous American military heroes, people like George Patton and Douglas MacArthur of World War II fame, as well as Eddie Rickenbacker and Alvin York as well. They're going to see action in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. the French and the American troops have to advance through the heavily fortified um, Argonne Woods to get to the Meuse River, where there are rail lines and bridges that they're going to capture. And if they can capture these infrastructure projects, then they can stop the German army and cut off their supplies, and ultimately they can force Germany to retreat, and they can prepare for a potential future invasion of Germany to end the war. Here is George Patton on the left and Douglas MacArthur on the right of this slide. Um, Douglas MacArthur, instead of his trademark corncob pipe, it looks like he has a cigar in his hand instead, and Patton is standing in front of a tank. Patton was one of the military officers who recognized the true power of tanks, and early in the war they had spread tanks across the entire advancing army. Infantry would be supported by tanks, like they were essentially like they were more mobile artillery pieces. But Patton realized that tanks were much more effective when you clustered them together and used them to break through the enemy lines, and then you could send your infantry in under the cover of the tanks. And that kind of thinking, that kind of strategizing is what's going to lead to, I would argue, the blitzkrieg of World War II. And of course, George Patton will also be a very important commander in World War II. And Douglas MacArthur will be a very important commander in World War II as well, though MacArthur was deployed in Europe in World War I. He's going to be the Allied commander in the Pacific in World War II. But there were all kinds of stories about MacArthur, that when he charged the enemy, he wasn't carrying a pistol, and that he wasn't wearing a helmet, and he was being reckless. MacArthur said that he wanted to be able to move as quickly as possible, and wearing a helmet and heavier gear made that harder to do so. And also he said that as an officer, his greatest weapon was not his sidearm, his pistol, but his ability to give orders. That was what was going to be the most effective. So that was how MacArthur explained his lack of use of proper arms and equipment. Here's an image of the Harlem Hellfighters, a African-American volunteer unit. By fighting against the Germans, by fighting against the tyranny of Germany, they're demonstrating that they deserve equality back in America, while the spirit of Abraham Lincoln looks down from heaven. This is Eddie Rickenbacker, America's flying ace, and Eddie Rickenbacker was from Ohio, but he was of German ancestry, and in fact, he had a slight German accent as well, and many native-born Americans didn't take him seriously. Perhaps they mistrusted him because of his German background, but he'd been a auto racer, a driver, before he became a pilot. In fact, a lot of the early pilots had been racers, car racers first, and Rickenbacker, he led missions in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. He kept the skies clear for the United States. He was essentially the German Red Baron, or rather the American version of the Germans, Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. He was a very courageous pilot and flying ace. Ran very successful missions against the German Flying Circus, which was the unit that was created by the Red Baron, although the Red Baron had since was killed before this battle happened. But being a pilot was very dangerous, high casualty rates. To make matters worse, American pilots did not use parachutes. They were not allowed to do so. The fear was, or their officers thought, that if they used parachutes, they would bail out of their planes too quickly, meaning that if your plane was shot and if it caught on fire, you were going to burn to death in the skies, or you were going to crash to earth and die. You wouldn't be able to survive. Here is a young Red Cross ambulance driver named Walt Disney, who will go on to be a very famous animator. You can actually see a little bit of his artwork here. He was too young to be in a combat position, so he served in the Red Cross instead in World War I, as did Ray Kroc, the founder of McDonald's as well. And here is Sergeant Alvin York, Alvin York was from Tennessee. He had become religious as a young adult, and he had become a pacifist as well. And he was a conscientious objector to the war. He was in the military, but he hoped to be in a non-combat position. But after having some conversations with his commanding officer, he was convinced that killing was not wrong in the context of a just war. And York had been a very, very good shot. He'd been a very successful hunter in Tennessee. And during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, Sergeant York will defeat a German machine gun nest. He will capture 139 German soldiers and kill 25 more, for which he will win the Medal of Honor. And the United States' success in the Meuse-Argonne offensive will stall Germany. By the fall of 1918, Germany is running out of supplies. There are strikes going on back in German cities, and there's even fears of a possible revolution. And this will lead the Germans to call for an armistice. And on November 11th, 1918, the armistice will begin. And this is why we celebrate Veterans Day in America on November 11th. It's called Remembrance Day in Canada and Britain, and it's a more somber day in those countries. We have Memorial Day here in the U.S., but a young artillery officer named Harry S. Truman, future U.S. president, he will fire some of the last artillery rounds before the armistice began in November of 1918. In a way, Truman fires some of the last rounds of World War I, and he orders the dropping of the atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So he's right there at the end of both World War I and World War II. Here are some images related to the Armistice of November 11th, 1918. The Armistice agreement was signed in a train car near the Meuse-Argonne front. After it was signed and the ceasefire, the armistice began, the world celebrated. The German Kaiser fled the country and went to the Netherlands, and President Woodrow Wilson made his peace proposals to the people of Europe and to the world. Here is President Wilson visiting France with General Pershing, the commander of the American troops. This was in December of 1918. President Wilson had published his plan for peace to prevent future wars. It was the 14 points, and the people of Europe were aware of many of Woodrow Wilson's very idealistic plans. And in some ways, Wilson had become more popular than even their own rulers were, because Wilson's plan was so idealistic and so forward-thinking and so progressive. Wilson also, in many ways, he is the first U.S. president to be an international celebrity as he traveled across Europe trying to sell the Europeans on his 14 points. Nowadays, U.S. presidents, by default, they're going to be celebrities. But this was a relatively new thing in the early 20th century as America is becoming more of a world power and emerging to a position of world leadership. And Woodrow Wilson definitely is going to be an important figure in helping America to get to that point. These are, in a nutshell, the 14 points. Wilson was proposing open diplomacy without secret treaties, no more complex, entangling alliances that will drag an entire continent into war, more or less an entire continent. He was also proposing free trade on the seas during both war and peace, no more unrestricted submarine warfare. The U.S. should be able to use its industrial might to sell goods and manufactured products across the world, both in peace and in war. Civilian shipping should be off limits. And basically the seas should be neutral, freedom of the seas, equal trade conditions. This was something that the Democratic Party was supportive of in this period. No tariffs. The United States, if it can sell a product, it ought to be able to sell the product in foreign markets. Again, this is very beneficial to the United States, perhaps a bit less so to other countries. Arms limitations and decreases should be signed by all nations. Colonial claims should be adjusted as well. Victorious powers like France and like Britain are not going to want to adjust their colonial claims. They're not going to want to give up. The British are not going to want to give up India, for example. The French are not going to want to give up their colonies in Africa. But losing powers like Germany, they can have their colonial claims be adjusted. The Central Powers will evacuate from Russia and not get involved in the Russian Civil War that is beginning as a result of the Russian Revolution. The Germans had assisted Vladimir Lenin of the Bolsheviks in coming back into power, and they're not going to be able to do that sort of thing anymore. Belgium would be evacuated and would become a free and independent country again after being occupied by Germany during the war. Alsace-Lorraine would be returned to the French as well. That was something that the French had wanted for since the 1870s, since they had lost the territory in the Franco-Prussian War. Italy will also gain territory as well, since they were on the Entente side. During this war, they're going to be getting a piece of the pie. They're on the winning side. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is going to be dissolved. That's what I mean when I say self-determination there. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a large, multi-ethnic collection of peoples, and the various ethnic groups ought to be able to have their own countries in the Balkans and even further to the north. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire is going to be dismembered after World War I is over, as will the German Empire and as will the Ottoman Empire. And of course the Russian Empire was dissolved as well after Tsar Nicholas abdicated the throne, and eventually he and his family are going to be really, really brutally executed or murdered by the Bolsheviks. A Turkish state will be created again. The Ottoman Empire is going to be dissolved, and the Polish people will have a nation state of their own. The Polish are always having their country taken from them in the early modern period. And then the final provision is the creation of a League of Nations, a precursor to the United Nations, which will allow for easier diplomacy and will prevent disagreements between countries before a possible war could begin. And these are very, very idealistic points. They sound great to many everyday people in Europe, but European leaders are going to feel very differently. Particularly, powers on the winning Entente side are not going to go for Wilson's peace without victory. They don't want to give up their colonies. The British certainly are not going to want to cede control of the seas and have the seas be neutral. Self-determination is great for your enemies, but it's not great for your own country, because that might mean losing territory for yourself. And what you're going to see is over time, Americans are going to reject many of Wilson's proposals as well in the 14 points. The Entente leaders largely reject Wilson's 14 points and his plan for peace without victory. David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of Great Britain, King Victor Orlando of Italy, George Clemenceau of France, they're going to reject these plans, particularly the leader of France. They want to extract their pound of flesh against Germany. They want to punish Germany for causing this war. And it's understandable, because the war had been fought for much longer by these countries. They'd had a lot more casualties, particularly the French. The war had been fought inside their territory. So it's understandable why they would want to have a harsher treaty that benefits them further. Instead, they want to rebuild their countries at Germany's expense, and they want to take away Germany's ability to ever threaten them ever again. So Germany's army and navy are going to be severely weakened. U-boats are going to be banned. Basically, Germany is only going to be allowed to have a small sort of border protection force. They're also going to pay reparations to the winning Entente powers, and these reparations are going to be paid in gold. So you have a situation where Germany is being forced to sign this very harsh treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed in June of 1919. But the Germans, they don't think that they've really lost this war. When they called for an armistice, they were hoping to work out more of a draw situation, a tie in this conflict. After all, they called for an armistice while they were still occupying French territory. In general, John Pershing of the United States, he said that this is not a good thing. The Germans, they don't really believe they've been beaten, in paraphrase, and that we need to keep fighting. We need to take this war to Germany, and then once the Germans have been convinced that they have really lost this war, then we can negotiate with them, and they'll accept the peace. But what happened basically was the Germans didn't think they had truly lost the war. They thought they had just run out of supplies and that they basically had been stabbed in the back. That was the language that certain German leaders are going to use after the war. Really, in some ways, it's sort of like what happened to the Confederate States of America after the American Civil War. The Confederacy had run out of supplies, and the Confederacy had surrendered not because their cause was less just or because they'd been truly crushed by the Union, but because they'd run out of supplies. And that was what many Confederates believed as the war came to an end and after. And that led to things like resentment towards Reconstruction, the rise of the KKK and other white supremacist paramilitaries in the South. And I think General Pershing, as an American, knowing his own country's history, he understood that if you really want to have peace, you have to make sure that your enemies understand they've been defeated. That way they will accept the treaties that you negotiate with them. So we'll talk a little bit more about the domestic reaction to the 14 points into the League of Nations. In 1918 and 1919, the Senate is dominated by the Republicans, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, who you can see here on the slide. And Lodge was a Republican, and he did not support Wilson's 14 points, not without major revisions. Lodge is often remembered as being an obstructionist who was just sort of throwing a wrench in President Wilson's plans for world peace. In actuality, it's not that he was against the 14 points entirely. It was he wanted there to be extensive revisions. He's often called a strong reservationist because he had reservations about the 14 points in their present form. And he wanted to make sure that they be revised to protect American national sovereignty. In particular, um, um, he did not want the United States to join the League of Nations because for people like Lodge, there was a fear that this League of Nations, which was supposed to prevent wars, could just end up dragging the United States into future conflicts that the United States did not want to be a part of. And Wilson also faced resistance from within his own party as well. William Jennings Bryan, the progressive Democrat, a very religious man, a pacifist by this point in his life, did not support Wilson either. Essentially what had happened was Wilson had become too progressive for the conservatives in both parties, and then too radical for the progressives in both parties. Remember, there are progressives in both the Democratic and the Republican parties in this period, but Wilson is kind of, in trying to do everything and be everything to everyone, he's angered the progressives and he's angered the conservatives as well. Wilson also actively campaigned for his 14 points, both abroad and in the United States. He really saw them as his magnum opus, his greatest work, and he was preparing to run for a third term, but then he suffered from a stroke in October of 1919, and this left him incapacitated for the rest of his presidency. And some believe that his wife Edith was essentially the shadow president during this period, forging his signature and basically acting as president of the United States for Wilson's final year in office, in which he had been incapacitated by a stroke. But we know a thing or two about incapacitated presidents today as well. Conclusion. The U.S. officially entered World War I in 1917, although it had supported the Entente since the beginning. Our special relationship with Great Britain, our preference for working with more democratic countries, it led us to support the Entente from the beginning, which led to Germany taking steps against the United States, most notably unrestricted submarine warfare, to stop the United States from supplying the Entente. And really, going to war in 1914, although there were reasons to do so, it would have gone against President Wilson's idealistic foreign policy, his moral foreign policy, which called for America to be better than the empires of Europe that all got sucked into this war through entangling alliances, through a desire for revenge, a desire for territorial aggrandizement. America had to be better, even though American lives were being threatened by German unrestricted submarine warfare policies. But when the United States did finally enter the war in 1917, the country had to mobilize very quickly in order to make a difference in the war in Europe. And really, this mobilization of America, its economy, its people, through taxation, through selective service, through control of the media, through propaganda campaigns, through even control of the food supply. These were key progressive goals that were accelerated by World War I. In many ways, it is the high point of the progressive movement. And in other ways, though, it leads to it's the beginning of the end of the progressive movement. It causes disagreements amongst progressives, particularly amongst the socialist and the pacifist progressives who don't support the war effort. And in some ways, it sows the seeds of destruction for the progressive movement. And American troops, once they get to Europe, while they are inexperienced, they really are wind in the sails for the British and French forces in the Entente, and they do play a major role in securing a victory for the Entente in the final battles of the war. And President Woodrow Wilson, he made plans for peace without victory through the 14 points. Because Americans had played a major role in this war, Wilson had every right to call for these proposals, but they were largely ignored by the European leaders who saw them as too idealistic, who really wanted to keep Germany down after this war, and even the American people largely rejected the 14 points. And the war in 1918 was over. Americans celebrated their country's victory, but new challenges are looming on the horizon. To wrap up this video, I want to include a coda about Germany's conditions for victory and the ethics of the U.S. entrance into World War I. To begin on the first point, Sun Tzu, the famous ancient Chinese military theorist, said, "Victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first and then seek to win." And Germany did the latter in World War I. There were certain key victory conditions that they absolutely needed, that they were out of their control. And Germany did have some key advantages at the war's outset. Their technology, their educational system had produced a very industrious and disciplined population. They had some major disadvantages, well, largely stemming from their geographic location, which I went over in great detail in this video. And to achieve their objectives, defeating France and then turning around to fight Russia, they had to use the Schlieffen Plan, which meant invading through a neutral country, Belgium. They absolutely needed Britain to stay out of the war, Britain with its large navy to stay out of the war, and they also needed the U.S. to not supply the Entente powers with food, weapons, financial loans, etc. And the U.S. has a special relationship with Britain and Entente power, and a friendly relationship with France, too. And Germany did not have control over whether Britain would honor its Belgian neutrality agreement. Instead, they counted on Britain to not go to war over that scrap of paper, as they called that treaty. So that's one key victory condition that they don't have full control over. And if they want to win this war, they have to make sure they have control over these conditions. Germany also did not have control over the U.S. trading relationship with other countries, which was a matter of national sovereignty, freedom of the seas. The U.S. wants free trade in this period. They want to be able to trade with their allies and with other countries. The U.S. is an industrial capitalist state, and our economy at this point depends on exporting a variety of products. We're a net exporter during this period. And Germany needed to keep the Entente from getting these supplies. They can attack transatlantic shipping to try to starve the Entente, but if they're too effective at this, if they're sinking too much transatlantic shipping, that's going to damage the U.S. economy, and it's going to cost the lives of U.S. citizens traveling across the Atlantic, as seen during the Lusitania sinking, and threats to the American economy, the spilling of American blood via unrestricted sub-warfare. That's going to motivate America to eventually enter the war, along with things like the Zimmermann telegram. In retrospect, theoretically, Germany could have won the Great War, World War I, had they had unlimited supply and had they not, had they been able to keep the Entente from getting these supplies, and had they been able to keep Britain out of the war. But that simply wasn't going to happen. Those two big conditions were things that were not in their full control. They can't control what Britain and the U.S. are going to do, and these were things that were essential to their victory. Britain staying out of the war, the United States not acting as a supplier for the Entente. And Germany did try to force an early end to the war with the Spring Offensive of 1918, and again with the November 11th armistice. The November 11th armistice that ends the fighting was signed while the Germans were still occupying French territory. In reality, they'd lost a war that was, for practical purposes, unwinnable based on the conditions they had created. And this leads some in Germany, most notably Adolf Hitler, a veteran of the war, to declare that Germany hadn't really lost the Great War. They'd been stabbed in the back by internal enemies, and that was the real reason they had lost. And now we'll talk about the U.S. entrance into World War I. While it's good to avoid warfare and bloodshed, it's better to use diplomacy, and it's better to have military deterrence. Prepare for peace, you must prepare for war. Para pacem, para bellum. The question remains, was it right for the U.S. to enter this war? Would it have been better had the U.S. stayed out of the conflict and not traded with Britain and France? Perhaps, but it wasn't Germany's right to constrict and restrict U.S. freedom of the seas and U.S. free trade. Our economy was based on foreign trade during this period. And in addition, Germany had threatened international norms on the balance of power in Europe and even outside of Europe. In the Pacific, they were trying to build an empire, and in Africa, they're trying to build an empire, and they're even trying to gain a foothold in the Western Hemisphere, in the U.S. sphere of influence in Latin America. And this was happening both before and during World War I. And Germany had escalated the conflict, invading neutral countries like Belgium. There were attacks and reprisals against Belgian civilians, what we would consider to be war crimes, and Germany had allied itself with oppressive, undemocratic governments, notably the Ottoman Empire, and they had also fomented a violent revolution in Russia. Partially fomented it, but also really escalated it by helping Vladimir Lenin get back to Russia. So if there is a aggressor in World War I, it's Germany. So that also leads to the question, should the U.S. have entered the war sooner? Perhaps, but the American people were very divided over the war, hence the need for things like the draft, the selective service system. And President Wilson does not want to maneuver the U.S. into a war that's opposed by large portions of the American public. That would have hurt his reelection prospects in 1916. He's a leader of the United States, but he's also a politician who wants to get elected and get his agenda passed through. Perhaps a different U.S. president, like, say, Teddy Roosevelt had. Roosevelt managed to win the 1912 election. Perhaps Roosevelt would have pressured Congress to declare war in 1914, or perhaps he would have used executive military action to send a small American expeditionary force without a formal declaration into the conflict. And that might have led to a congressional declaration of war later on. So after World War I, people from across political perspectives, both left and right, they criticized the U.S. involvement in the war. They criticized war profiteering, and were very critical of the U.S. involvement in this conflict. As time has gone on, voices in the center and the right and the left have become more supportive of the U.S. involvement in the war. There were some more radical voices, first on the left, people like Howard Zinn, for example, who was very critical of the U.S. entrance to the war. He saw it as a capitalist war when what we needed was a socialist revolution in America. But more recently, I have seen some voices on the right oppose the U.S. entrance into World War I as well. So it is a controversial subject should the U.S. have entered World War I, even to this day, although for the most part, the academic consensus, regardless of where you fall politically, is that it was justified for the United States to enter into World War I. But of course, you should make up your mind yourself about this war. And you shouldn't feel that you have to believe a certain thing because of what political faction you're a part of.